Good morning, chameleon wranglers. Hello, all. It looks like, wow, we got a whole lot going on in the chat already. Woo! And with me, of course, is Rus from Aquarimax Pets.
Good morning, everyone, or good day.
And he has been, when I have isopod questions, he's just always there to answer it. And boy, he'll just answer anything. It is awesome. So, wait a minute.
I just want to say hi, everybody.
That's Rus.
Hi, Rus. Oh, hey, I'm like,
oh yeah, you need to get back there. Yeah, I've kind of.
He's whatever. That's okay.
Yeah, the camera follows me so. Studio adventure. Oh boy, yeah. Last time I saw you, Rus, was at the grand opening for Clint's reptile room.
Yeah,
that was quite the adventure.
It was all kinds of fun. I so glad we got to go, and I'm so glad I got to meet you there in person.
Yeah. Oh, that was. Let's see. We got everybody. Everybody's here. I can't say hello to everybody. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. And okay, Stephanie. This is Stephanie, who has been watching for a little while there.
Hello.
And
glad you're here.
All right. So everybody, we are. I mean, you've heard the podcast. And well, maybe you haven't, but it doesn't matter. We are here to talk about isopods. And just as a background, I have, you all know that I'm putting together that enclosure back there. And oh, wait a minute. James is in the house. So let's see. It's time for the ceremonial letting loose of the fog.
Ooh.
We do this, Rus.
That's cool. I like that.
This is part of our thing. Oh, so we're gonna. Oh, yeah. I have been remiss because I forgot a huge announcement. Everybody, as you know, there are shadowy elements of a secret society flittering about through the chat, and you never know exactly who they are. They have been referred to as the Illuminati, and all I know is that when I just kind of mentioned it in a live session, I got a mysterious package in the mail. So be very careful about what you say. But let's just say in honor of the this society, which of course doesn't exist, I'd like to introduce the new Illuminati t-shirt that I have created for anyone who is interested in saying, oh, you know what? We need to share. Let's go ahead and share the just so you can see the graphic. There we go. So this is the graphic that I've come up with. And you all know, if you were here and you saw the drama or took a look at the vlog that I did about the drama, we'll just call it the incident. You will notice that there is an homage to that incident in the middle A. I have gotten permission from people that don't exist to include that mysterious symbol in this shirt. And if any of you are interested in buying that shirt, mug, hoodie, sweatshirt, you can go to the store that's on ChameleonAcademy.com, where you usually buy the Chameleon Academy stuff, and that design is available for purchase. Just scroll down the homepage until you get to the shop. And it is available for any of you who would like to let everybody know that Illuminati does not exist and you are not one of them. So there we go. Let's see. How do I take this down? That's right. Yeah, I was actually test driving it yesterday and wearing that around Home Depot and such. It's amazing how many people asked me, what's the Illuminati? Come on. I said, don't ask about it. But, people get themselves in trouble. Curiosity killed the cat. So, all right. Now, everyone here, we have someone who is very experienced with isopods. And so now is the time to bring forth any interesting questions you have about isopods. These things, they're functional and they are ornamental and incredible. I can tell you that once you get isopods, it's just like candy. You cannot stop. And they're just so able to be kept in small areas, and they're happy being kept in small areas. And it's so easy to have a lot of those small areas. And so I got to tell you, we now are up to 4 different kind of isopods here in this household, and are on the move to, we're going to be getting at least another one, probably another 2, and it never stops at that.
True.
So,
True.
So anyway, if you have questions about isopods, please put them in the comments. And while you guys are figuring out what to ask about these wonderful creatures, I'll ask Rus, what is the isopod community like? It's like we didn't hear anything about them, and then all of a sudden, for people not in the community, I'm sure there was always a community, but outside the community, all of a sudden, there is just another incredible addiction that just seemed to pop up out of nowhere.
Right.
Where did the community come from, and why is it now exploding?
Well, the origins of the community are back in the 90s, but it was kind of a slow burn for a while because basically people started keeping them in bioactive enclosures for dart frogs back in the 90s. And there were just a couple of species that were kept. And then it was right around, I want to say 2013 or so, when a few of the zebra isopods were imported. And since these have this amazing, black and white essential zebra-like pattern, everybody got really excited about that. And they started, that kind of kicked off the isopod hobby into keeping things not just for a bioactive purpose, but for their pattern, for their color, for the display potential. And from there, it just kind of snowballed. We started importing isopods from all over the place, and finding and selectively breeding morphs of the ones we already did have. And then the Cubaris, like the rubber duckies, came on the scene, and they sort of kicked it up another notch. And now we have things like the Marulinella genus that have kicked it up another couple of notches with their amazing colors and their tendency to be out in the open and visible. So yeah, it just keeps coming. And I don't know if there's going to be an end to it. We still have other isopods that are being discovered and brought into the hobby. So now there are so many.
Come into it. You mean that they are continually being discovered, like rubber duckies that just been recently discovered?
Yeah, at least from the standpoint of from the hobby. Some of these isopods that are now hobby staples and are fairly recent introductions, but have become very popular, were known scientifically, and some were not. There are several places in the world where there seems to be a lot of adaptive radiation for isopods that has occurred. And so Southeast Asia is a hotbed of all these new types of isopods that are being discovered. Many of them are brought in and labeled with a genus, but then just like Cubaris species and then a common name. There are many of those, and some of those are probably, most of them are not even in the Cubaris genus. Actually, they're labeled that way for now, for convenience sake, because they haven't really been described. And another place, Southern Europe, specifically places like Italy, France, Spain, Greece, also have a lot of isopods that are beautiful. They have interesting patterns. A lot of them get really big. And so that's another place where a lot of them have come into the hobby. Most of those we do know are actually from the genus Porcellio, and they have valid common names, but they're another place where when the hobby started, they just started bringing in all these different types from there into the hobby, and where they weren't in the hobby before.
Okay. Well, let's see. We got some questions here. What's the best substrate to use?
That is a fairly controversial topic, but I will say that many substrates are possible. Some are probably better than others. I read a really old paper that was from a peer-reviewed journal where people were doing studies with isopods. They just put moist plaster of Paris down and then put leaf litter on top of it. And isopods absolutely thrived in that setup. So it's very possible for it to be quite simple. Back in the day, when I was first getting into isopods, the common wisdom was to just have moistened cocoa fiber on the bottom and then put leaf litter over the top of that. I raised thousands and thousands of healthy isopods on it. Today, it's frowned upon to use cocoa fiber, but I think it's been a little bit too vilified for isopods. It can cause problems to some organisms, but for most isopods, as long as they have plenty of leaf litter on top of it, they can do really well. It's trying to give them cocoa fiber as their only substrate and not give them leaf litter. They can have issues because they're not getting enough nutrition. But I think that's where the vilification came from. I tend to use a variety of substrates. One is just organic compost as the base substrate. And sometimes I'll mix some additives in and then put leaf litter over that. And that works really well. But I also use some premium substrates. I use one called BioLives. And I've used several others that work well too. And it's got all kinds of things in it, from composted fermented wood, which is great for them. It's got bat guano in it, which some isopods come from cave systems, and that's one of their main food sources. So there's so many options. So saying there's a best substrate is hard to say. I would say as long as you put a nice layer of decaying leaf litter over something that's not going to kill the isopods, that's going to retain some moisture, that doesn't have toxins in it, any of the options that I mentioned are fine.
Okay. And Eliza Ann comes in. Thank you, Eliza, for asking the question that everybody wants to know.
Okay.
What are some of the easy starter isopods?
Easy starter isopods. If you want an isopod that's going to breed a lot, and some chameleon keepers would probably be really interested in that because they can serve as a supplementary food source, I would say get into something like the dairy cows or the milkbacks. And we talked about that in the previous video that we had on the interview. Because they breed very, very well, they're not afraid of light. They tend to get fairly large. So they can be a great one. If you're looking for a display isopod, they're also great. If you're looking for bioactive, they can be good for a chameleon because they breed fast and can handle some predation, but they will also be out and about doing things. They have an amazing not prey drive. What I want to say is feeding response. So you throw some food into an enclosure with a good number of dairy cows or milkbacks, and they will swarm that food, and it's fun to watch. Some others you can do, Porcelionides or Porcelionides, Pruinosis, also known as the powders. They're the powder blues that are the wild types. There are powder oranges. There are Oreo crumbles, which are a white kind of pied on the natural gray color. There are orange creams, which are the orange version of that with the white markings. There are whiteouts, which are completely white, even the eyes. And then there are like the party mixes where you have some of all of those. And there are other morphs too, but those are some of the more common ones. They are extremely active. They're colorful. They're fun to watch. They're not afraid. They have a great feeding response. So when you throw food in there, they'll come and eat it. They breed very prolifically and can make a great bioactive isopod in a lot of enclosures. They might be a little small for some of the bigger isopods to eat, but they'd be a great feeder for smaller chameleons, younger ones, things like that. And they breed fast enough that would be feasible. So those are great. If you're looking more in terms of just a display isopod, something like Armadillidium maculatum zebra or Armadillidium gestroi is another good one. Very, very strong patterns, very visible. Both of those species I just mentioned are mimics of a pill millipede that lives in the areas of Europe where they're from. And so not only are they very visually striking, they also tend to be a little less afraid. So they're out and about. They're very active and interesting to watch. Those are some of my top picks. I would say Porcelio scaber is a great one too. That's a very easy isopod to care for, very hardy, and they get a little bigger than the Porcelionides, the powders. Not quite as big as the dairy cows or the milkbacks. They come in so many different color varieties, and they're great for breeding projects if you want to do some selective breeding, because there are already so many types, and you can cross this type and see how they interact and things like that.
All right. We have a little bit of an issue. Let's figure out what's going on. Hi, Russ. I find my powder orange isopods in the feeder cup for my chameleon every morning. There's no food in it. Strange. Your thoughts why?
Well, they are very exploratory. Like I was mentioning, they're not afraid and they'll be out and about. And that's true in the day, it's true in the night. And so because they're very exploratory, they're probably climbing up branches, climbing up into the plants, and falling into the feeder cup, most likely. That's what's happening.
Okay.
So they can dry out if the air humidity is not high enough. But other than that, it's not really a big problem.
Okay. Marcia Ann's asking, I'm trying to start a colony. I have a few dairy cows and orange ones. What can I do to help them multiply?
Okay. Well, Marcia, the first thing I would ask, are you keeping them together, the dairy cows and the orange ones? Because if so, it's probably best to keep them separate to get them the best results in breeding, because otherwise one is likely going to outcompete the other. And in most scenarios, it would be the dairy cows outcompeting the oranges, but it does depend on which orange ones you have. There are many different species that are orange. At any rate, I would make sure that they get, like I said, plenty of leaf litter. Decaying leaf litter is best, a mix of different leaves, and also give them some supplemental food with some calcium and a little bit of protein, like we were talking about shrimp, dried shrimp, which are sold for use with isopods specifically. You can also buy them for treats for turtles and fish and things at pet stores. And throwing a few of those in, you can use fish food pellets. They really go after fish food pellets, something like that. Making sure they get enough of that that will really help boost their breeding. I would say also make sure that you don't overfeed with that kind of stuff. And one way to make sure you don't overfeed is to have a little dish. Like I like to use a scallop shell. You can buy scallop shells online and like in a pack of 100 for very cheap. And they're very shallow and flat. And so an isopod's not likely to get trapped in a dish like that, but it helps you monitor how much food you're giving. You put a little bit of fish food in that, or one of the other foods, the shrimp, whatever we were talking about. And if you see the isopods eating it, great. If you come back after 24 hours and they haven't eaten it, you can leave it in there a little longer, but you know you're probably fed too much. And keep checking it. If it gets moldy, take it out and restart and reduce the quantity. And that way you can fine tune the quantity as your isopod population grows, because mold can cause problems. It can, too much mold, of course, can cause things like CO2 buildup in the enclosure, which can be bad for the isopods, can outgas them basically to death, which would be a horrible scenario. Also, we have the fact that the mold fibers, the filaments of mold can trap, especially young isopods. So you want to make sure mold is removed and any food that starts to mold is removed. But other than that, that's a good way to just be flexible with the amount of food you give them so that you benefit them maximally without causing those issues.
All right, Russ, straight talk. Don't sugarcoat it.
Okay.
Do isopods bite?
Okay. I have had hungry isopods climb onto my hand when I have my hand in the enclosure and attempt to bite me, but it is entirely painless. You can feel like a very small tickle, and that's all you feel. Very small tickle, never broke the skin. I would not describe it as remotely painful. It is just an attempt to get some food, and it generally means time to feed this colony for sure, but it's never been an issue. I've heard of people talking about isopods biting them and they feel it more than just a little tickle, but that has never happened to me, unless you're talking about some of the marine isopods. Like there's a species that will parasitize fish and will attack their tongue. It targets their tongue, and then after the tongue dies, it will replace the tongue functionally, serve as a fish tongue.
Yeah, we're not interested in that one.
No.
Oh my goodness.
So,
that is a horrible.
So there are no isopods that I have ever interacted with that have ever caused me any pain whatsoever when they have attempted to nibble on me.
Okay. Chris is wondering, how about substrates not to use?
Not to use. Well, I think it's a fairly risky proposition to go out in your backyard and dig up some topsoil. and throw it in. There are a couple of reasons for that. One, it could be contaminated with pesticides and or heavy metals. That could cause some issues for the isopods. Another thing is that you can get hitchhikers that way. Anything from little centipedes that will prey upon your isopods to nematodes that could potentially range from unsightly to parasitic to any number of other things that could show up in the enclosure when you do that. And that is why I don't just go out and dump soil from outside into the enclosure and use it for a substrate.
All right. And what's the lifespan?
Oh, okay. Most isopods in the hobby will live, and it depends. There's sort of a curve, some will live a little longer, some a little shorter, but you can probably count on 1.5 to 2 years for most specimens on average. Some will, like I said, vary from that. There are some species that are in the hobby, like Armadillo officinalis, can live for 9 to 12 years.
Wow.
An individual isopod, which is awesome. But they do tend to restock themselves. Most isopods kept well will reproduce. It's just part of keeping them. So you can have a colony of isopods that you keep perpetually, even if some of the individuals are passing on over time. And that, with very few exceptions, as long as they're kept well, you don't have that issue.
Okay. How about the pH of the soil? How important is it?
I don't really test the pH of the soil. I do add sometimes some buffering agents to the soil. Like when I mentioned using organic compost as a base, but I will often use ground eggshell and add that to it. It's kind of a buffer with the calcium carbonate in the eggshell. Can help keep the pH from going too acidic. And the isopods also will nibble on that calcium source. So I think it's beneficial. But I don't really test for that. Talking about specifically a bioactive enclosed. So if we're talking about, and many people have asked me about this, doing a completely enclosed bioactive enclosure where you have enough plant growth to produce oxygen and you just keep it basically sealed most of the time. I don't have any experience doing that with isopods. I have done sealed terraria, but I haven't done them with isopods, so I can't really comment on that.
Okay. All right. Interesting question about soil mites. Stephanie hates them and she's trying to keep adding springtails every week to try and outcompete them. You have any insight into soil mites?
Well, soil mites, and the key here, what Stephanie's talking about, I know they're not bad, but the problem is that soil mites, there are a lot of different soil mites. And so we can't just say, okay, this species of soil mite, because we don't know which one you have. And also there are so many that it would be hard to narrow it down. Completely getting rid of them is tricky. Reducing their numbers is feasible. Adding the springtails is good. But when you mention that you're adding the springtails every week, it sounds like the springtails perhaps are not breeding the way that we would expect springtails to breed. It could be that the mites you have are actually mites that prey on springtails. If you feel like the springtails are not able to establish themselves very well, you might actually have one of the predatory mites. And I'm not talking about the parasitic mites that plague reptiles. Very, very different thing we're talking about here is mites that target other mites. They target fungus gnats. They target springtails and other small microfauna. So if you have an issue getting your springtails established, that could be what's going on. Now, one thing that I'm just going to assume for a moment, I may be wrong, but I assume that you're talking about a dedicated isopod enclosure. If that is the case, then as the isopods increase in population, they will tend to outcompete the soil mites. And you might find that they will disappear eventually just on their own. If you're talking about a bioactive vivarium, that may be another thing. We need to look into why the springtails are not reaching the population density they need to kind of outcompete mites. But if they are predatory mites, that would explain it.
Okay. How about good monetary spend on getting a good setup that isn't bare minimum? So that's a great question to us to really look into. I mean, let's go ahead. I think I've got them back here. There we go. So this is how I've been keeping my isopods.
Mm-hmm. Oh, like in a 16 quart? Yeah.
Yeah.
Stairlight tub.
There's my orange. I've got my powder oranges in there.
Okay.
In there somewhere. So is this, I mean, in the chameleon community, we've been doing a lot of talking about minimalistic versus naturalistic keeping to enrich the quality of life of our animals.
Mhm.
And well, isopods are animals. So the question is this minimalistic keeping, or is this just how they enjoy being kept?
Well, great question. And I think if you're going for what the isopods prefer, then they don't care, as long as they have plenty of hiding places, they don't care how much light is passing through the side of the enclosure. So you got the translucent one, like the Stairlight tub that you just showed. You get some of the display enclosures that are completely transparent. And then you can have opaque enclosures or semi-opaque enclosures. They don't really care about that, as long as they have plenty of places to hide. Most isopods are a little bit negatively phototactic. They will flee from light. And there are some exceptions, which I highlighted because they tend to be good display species that are less concerned about it. But like you had powder oranges in there, they don't seem to care so much about light. So I think with isopods, trying to make the enclosure good for them doesn't matter what the enclosure looks like so much, but it will matter more about the substrate depth and the different surfaces they have, because they are also positively thigmotactic. They love to attach themselves to things and feel surfaces up against them. They also produce an aggregating pheromone that in their frass, which signals to other isopods that this is a good place to hang out. Come hang out here, and they will congregate in areas, but they need a surface to do that. So the more you can provide different surfaces for them to hide on at different areas of moisture. So you want some flat and slightly concave hides on the moist side of the enclosure. You want some flat and slightly concave hides on the drier side, and everywhere in between. The more of those hides you're providing, the happier you're going to make your isopods. That's what they care about in terms of enrichment. And then I think that is honestly the most important thing when we're talking about something other than food. They need a variety of hides, and they need to be able to regulate their moisture requirements and still remain in those hides.
All right. Dr. Bob is here and is wondering, where do we get all these wonderful little creatures?
Well, they're really available online these days. They're also available more often than they used to be in pet stores. So you can go walk into a PetSmart, Petco, and pick up isopods. It's usually a pretty limited selection, but it's possible to do. Online, though, is a really good way to get a lot of isopods. Reptile expos usually have a lot of isopods available. I do a local expo, and I'll bring, maybe 20, 30 different types of isopods, sometimes more. And I also ship them. And there are a lot of people who do. They ship really easily. Isopods, unlike a lot of reptiles, you want to ship through a specific reptile service, reptile shipping service, like I do with my snakes. But with isopods, they can do really well in priority mail as long as the package is prepared correctly. So it's not necessarily very expensive to get them shipped either.
Now, do you have any limitations as to what you can ship and where you can ship?
I do. And honestly, in the isopod hobby, this is one of the controversies, I guess, in the hobby. USDA APHIS regulates interstate movement of isopods. That's a thing. They do that, and any species of isopod is regulated. They don't have any that are exempt. There are a lot of other insects that are exempt, and isopods, of course, not being insects, but they have other arthropods, I should say, that are exempt, including many insects. But isopods are not exempt. So in order to ship them across state lines, you need to have a permit. And you can only have a permit there are approximately 20 species that are available to be shipped with a permit. And I have a permit to ship those. There are some restrictions, like can't ship any to Hawaii, and that makes sense. And there are some other states, like Louisiana is one, Florida is one, where they're limited what I can ship. I can ship some there, but not all of the species that I keep, and not the entire list of 21 species that are permitted can't be shipped either. So it's basically boils down to isopod species that already have been documented to live within the continental United States, those are approved for shipping across state lines. Anything else, you have to have a containment facility for them and a different type of permit to be able to ship or receive them.
Okay. All
But
right.
the common ones, like I was speaking about before, those are all fair game. They can be shipped across state lines with a permit. Someone who's buying them doesn't need to have a permit, but the seller needs to have one.
Okay. Marcia Ann is asking, is it safe to use decaying leaves from the yard? Should I wash or bake them?
Okay, great question. Also controversial in the isopod hobby. This gives you a little feel of how the community is going and how it's been developing. Is decaying leaves are great for isopods because the bacterial and presumably fungal and other microbiological actions that are going on in those decaying leaves, when they're actively, moist and decaying, that's extremely nutritious for isopods. Dry leaves that are not decaying, not so much. I mean, they'll eat them and they'll get something out of them, but they're not all that nutritious unless they're in that decaying stage. The only problem is if you scoop up a bunch of leaves from your yard and take them and give them to your isopods, you could be introducing some of those issues like I was talking about. I've heard people say, yeah, I never sterilize my leaves and I throw them in. I've never had problems. And I have other people say, well, I used to do that. And then stone centipedes started breeding my isopod enclosures and ate all my isopods. So there is a risk to putting those decaying leaves into your enclosures without washing or baking them. But once you wash or bake them, you're removing a lot of those nutrients. One beneficial way you can do this that can sort of the best of both worlds, and I'm experimenting with more efficient ways to do this right now, but you can take a bucket or other bin, something container, put a whole bunch of dry leaves in the fall in that, or it doesn't have to be the fall, but whenever they're available, put a whole bunch in them, cover them with water, and maybe put a little bit of molasses in that water to help kind of jumpstart the bacteria, and just let them sit there for a few months. It will accelerate their decay, and things like stone centipedes, spiders, and so on are not going to thrive in that container full of water. And so then after they've gone for a few months, leached out some of the tannins, so the bacteria are doing some things, they're not going to be inhibited by the water. You can scoop up some of that knowing, okay, I can just kind of squeeze this out, throw it in, and not have to worry about a lot of the pests that I would otherwise have to worry about.
Okay. And Sophie Cullen, is it okay to mix dairy cow and Trichorina tomentosa together in bioactive enclosure? And I don't know what that is.
Okay. Trichorina tomentosa is known also as the dwarf white isopod. And in the hobby, it's often referred to as the devil's rice because there's these little white, they look kind of like little rice grains when you see them on the surface. And they are infamous for appearing in places you didn't put them. They just teleport into all these enclosures. And the problem is, the reason why they can teleport is because they're very small, inconspicuous, and they reproduce through parthenogenesis. So it only takes one, and then you can get an entire new population going, which I believe is how they showed up in the dart frog hobby to begin with. They just came in on some plant that was imported or whatever, and then people found them showing up. So I would say that the worst problem that we've noticed with Trichorina tomentosa is great in a bioactive enclosure, especially one that's more on the humid side, but they tend to outcompete most other isopods over time.
Okay.
Partly because they will bother they can get to such population densities, they can bother the females and they might abort their young too early, things like that. That's one of the reasons it's been suspected. But whatever mechanisms, they tend to outcompete. There are a few others. I've heard of people saying dairy cows will actually eat Trichorina tomentosa, but it's going to be a battle either way. Somebody's going to outcompete the other one. So I would say, if you're interested in seeing how that shakes out, you can put them both together, but I can bet that within 2 to 3 years, you're going to have one species of isopod in there.
Okay. Mike's asking, do isopods pose any risk to reptiles in the enclosure?
I think it's safe to say that most healthy isopods are most healthy reptiles. Adult reptiles in an active stage are not generally at risk in good conditions from most isopods. A very sluggish, sick reptile potentially could be at risk. Eggs could be at risk. But we don't have a lot of data on this. We do have cases where people say, oh, I just looked in my enclosure and my insert reptile here was dead and there were isopods all over it and, drilling holes in it and everything. And it's horrible to think about. But when that can't be attributed to the isopods necessarily. Generally, isopods will leave living creatures alone. But as soon as it's dead, they're fair game and they notice very quickly when it's dead. Mm. So if it had died from other causes and been swarmed by the isopods, they can't be blamed for having attacked it and killed it. But I did explain how the isopods crawled on me when they were very hungry and started trying to nibble on me. It didn't do me any harm, but potentially isopods or reptiles with very sensitive skin, if they were in a situation where isopods were hungry enough to do that, could be a problem. Isopods shouldn't ever really get that hungry in an enclosure. If they get that hungry, there's a problem. Now, that's one thing in an isopod enclosure where it's just dedicated to raising isopods. The population density is going to be very high. And so ideally, they still shouldn't be that hungry. But it's a little bit more of a likely scenario that they're going to be, get that hungry. In a bioactive enclosure, they never really should, because there should be enough leaf litter and other things that they're eating. So they should never reach the point where they're going to climb onto a reptile and eat it. If they do, that probably could be more attributed to you're not renewing the leaf litter frequently enough to make sure your isopods are okay. And that is something you should be avoiding anyway. So I would say we really don't have enough data. We need more. We need people reporting exactly what happened, when it happened. If they see, I have occasionally seen beetles nibbling on reptiles and, had to solve that problem really quickly. But I've never seen an isopod attack a living reptile. Does that mean it never happens? No, but it does mean after years of keeping bioactive enclosures with reptiles and isopods in them, I haven't had an issue with it. And I've also had eggs hatch successfully, reptile eggs hatch successfully in enclosures where isopods are living and thriving.
Yeah, I think it's important for all of us to know we have so many urban legends that have sprung up from seeing insects, arthropods, invertebrates on dead bodies. And the immediate, the whole thing about, the superworm killed my chameleon from eating out from its stomach. Well, yeah, someone saw a superworm coming out of a dead chameleon stomach. Doesn't mean that happened while the chameleon was alive or the animal was alive. And as soon as these bodies give up the ghost, they very quickly start sending out odors that say fresh meat. And so we have to be very careful when we hear about reports of, these attacked the eggs, these attacked my lizard, because it's so easy to make that logical leap and then come to a sensationalistic conclusion that just spreads like wildfire because everybody loves drama. So we have to be careful.
Exactly. And I think that's a very good point. And also when those stories are passed along nowadays, often with some accompanying video, like here is my deceased lizard and there are isopods crawling all over it, munching on it. And so when they see that, many people take that as, there's proof, when it's not, in fact, proof that a lizard was attacked when it was alive.
And I think if anybody wants to document this, then document the live sleeping chameleon, not the dead body, because I know it's hard. How do you video the time of death or the time of attack? And it's difficult, but we all need to take the responsibility of not making a leap of logic and assuming that it's true. If we're going to make that leap of logic, let's go ahead and figure out a way to test it, right, and document it.
Right. And I think that is a great idea, what you mentioned. If we go and we take video of our sleeping chameleons, we know we have healthy population of isopods at this enclosure, and at night you go in and you see, there are 7 dairy cows on this chameleon, and they seem to be attempting to nibble on it. And then you can say, okay, well, what's the next step? Are they damaging it, or are they just kind of exfoliating? What are they doing? As soon as you can start presenting evidence that something is happening or something is not happening. That's what we need, rather than, yeah, like you said, the sensationalism spreading for no apparent reason.
All right. My chameleon hunts isopods. Yes, mine does as well. But today he caught a bit of substrate with the isopod. Is it dangerous for him?
That would be more a question for you, I think, Bill, than me.
And it's impaction can happen, but usually impaction happens with chameleons that are not healthy to begin with. And the question is, why are they eating substrate? And there's so much surrounding this whole idea of impaction in the chameleon community. When a chameleon dies, it is very easy to find something to blame other than the chameleon was suffering from poor husbandry. And when chameleons are suffering from poor husbandry, they can't digest as well. They can't do their normal functions. And so things that normally should pass without a problem can cause a problem, or the person does a necropsy and says, wow, there's substrate in this stomach. That must have killed my chameleon. So once again, we're doing logical leaps that get into the community and just spread like wildfire. So that's why you hear a lot of substrate can hurt a chameleon. And I don't know if you've heard all of that, but that's out there. Now, as for, is it dangerous? Little bits are not dangerous. Now, it can be, depending upon what they bring back. Like little bits of dirt and organic stuff will pass without a problem. But there's always things that happen. And I had one chameleon that passed away because it zapped an insect on a bamboo leaf, a long bamboo leaf, brought the leaf back in and just started chomping the leaf and trying to get the entire bamboo leaf, which is longer than its body, through its system. And so I came to find a chameleon dead halfway through the bamboo leaf. And I think that's a pretty safe logical leap to see what happened there. So there are cases where something they can bring back could be dangerous. But generally speaking, getting a little bit of substrate in is not something to panic over. So let's see. Okay, let's see. Go through. There we go. Fun. Aside from isopods and springtails, any other invertebrates recommended for bioactive enclosures? Yeah, we always hear about springtails and isopods. Anything else that is good?
Yeah. I've experimented with quite a few different things. Let me think of some of them. Well, I actually like, and it depends on the setup, but for some setups, superworms can actually make a great bioactive cleanup crew. You need to be careful to regulate their population and make sure they don't get too hungry, because I have seen the superworm beetles actually nibbling on live reptiles, like breaking the skin and having to, address that. So I have to be really careful. And so I wouldn't recommend this be done in a very casual manner. Like, I'm just going to throw a whole bunch in there and see what happens. You have to watch them and keep the numbers down, make sure they're getting enough food. But they're actually really good at eating feces. Very good at that. Other darkling beetles like mealworm beetles, if the enclosure is appropriate. Superworm beetles tend to be pretty adaptable, and they like a little bit of moisture in their substrate. If you're going to use them as a bioactive cleanup crew, and the beetles are long-lived, they live a couple of years and things like that. But mealworm beetles in a slightly drier enclosure work really well too, and are less likely to cause issues. If they get a little hungry, they're not as likely to nibble on something. So that can be another option. The Alphatobius diaperinus, the buffalo beetle, is a small, much smaller beetle than a mealworm beetle, and that's an option too.
Okay. All right. There's something going on here, Russ.
Mm-hmm.
They hiss it. What are we talking about?
Oh, I think Frank the Tank is talking about Armadillo officinalis.
Yes, that is what he's talking about. What the heck? What are we talking about here, Russ?
So this is a fairly large isopod that looks a little bit, the body shape is like a pill bug or roly-poly type of body shape. They can roll into a ball just like the normal ones we find in our backyards and whatnot. And they're a European species that's not commonly established in the U.S. Apparently, it's there's no record of it being established in the U.S., so it's but it is in the hobby, and it gets fairly large. And if you have enough of them together, when they are disturbed, you can hear the little hisses coming from them. They're apparently stridulating, and I don't know what organs they're rubbing together to make this stridulation, but they do it, and it's fascinating. They're unusual. They're the only species really in the hobby from that genus, Armadillo, and they're the ones that can live to be, 8, 9, 10, 12 years old. They get pretty big, and then they make this hissing noise. So they're pretty unique.
All right. Tig is saying, hey, decaying. Should we be composting in our isopods?
Isopods are isocomposting is a thing. And
really?
Yeah, sometimes people who compost with like the red wiggler worms will add isopods as kind of a complement to the red wiggler worms, but you can just compost with your isopods as well. And so things like the old carrot tops and wilted lettuce, that kind of thing, I have thrown that sort of thing in isopod enclosures. Ideally, you make sure this kind of thing is washed well first, because pesticides may or may not cause issues, but certain pesticides can definitely harm isopods. But yeah, bits of vegetable and so on that are wilted and things will make excellent food for your isopods.
Okay, Mikey's asking about type of water, like filtered water, distilled water, tap water. What is there an important water?
Well, it kind of depends on what your particular water source, because some people have waters that's heavy in chloramines or different things like that. But generally, I use just filtered tap water. It goes through a activated carbon filter on my fridge, and I fill up my containers with that water as it goes through the activated carbon, and that's what I use. There's no particular benefit to removing the minerals. We have pretty hard water where I live from the isopods, other than the you can get buildup of the kind of the hard water stains on the enclosure over time if you're not careful. But other than that, it's not a big deal.
All right. Yo Tango is asking about earwigs. Yeah, that's a good question. Earwigs. Sometimes they make their way in. What's the deal with earwigs?
Okay. Well, I've heard of people using earwigs in a cleanup crew. I've never tried it. There are some earwigs that can be fairly predatory, and they are opportunistic. So that could be an issue with whatever you're keeping them with potentially. If you're keeping them in a bioactive with things like chameleons, earwigs do tend to produce repugnatorial fluids that are pretty strong. And they can pinch. Some species are more capable of pinching than others, so I wouldn't recommend putting it in with anything that might attempt to eat them for those two reasons: the nasty chemicals that they'll release, and also the fact that they could get pinched. People sometimes, I've read, even in like encyclopedia entries, earwigs can't pinch, but I have been pinched by some of the larger earwigs. It can happen. So,
oh yeah, oh yeah, I have done that, and whenever I feed them to the chameleons, I make sure I clip off those pinchers, because chameleon will go for the head, and and usually the chameleon crunches the head before anything can happen. But if there's a miss, that tail and those pinchers are coming right up, and they can reach the eye.
Yeah, and that would be a bad day for everyone involved.
Yeah.
So have you ever noticed the chameleons reacting to the repugnatorial fluids of the earwigs? Interesting. Okay. I guess everybody's different with that. I find the repugnatorial fluid of earwigs absolutely, it's intense for me. Like, really bothers me if I even smell it in the room. It's super intense. But I guess if it doesn't bother chameleons, it's not such a big deal.
I had a chameleon, a large Meller's chameleon, one of the largest chameleon species, and it escaped. A rat had chewed a hole through the back of its cage, and the chameleon escaped before I figured this out. And of course, I am looking up in the tree, and like a week or two goes by, I'm looking in the trees. I do not find this chameleon until about 2 weeks later. I found the chameleon. Unfortunately, it died. But I did a necropsy, and inside it had been feasting on earwigs.
Okay.
That was one of the main things. So it wasn't up in the tree; it was in the bushes, and it was just after. Now I'm not sure how the cause of death. It looked like it was it ran into some other creature. So it wasn't like, oh, I'm poisoned. It was not it was a confrontation. But yeah, that really surprised me.
Yeah, that is very surprising with the intensity of what they produce. But I guess if it doesn't bother them, maybe they've just evolved to deal with those kinds of chemicals.
All right. When we're talking about decaying leaf litter, is it different from dried leaves fallen off a tree?
Okay. Well, ideally, the stage at which isopods eat it, first it will fall off the tree and it'll dry on its own, and then it will be wet enough for long enough that the leaves will start to decay. They'll be full of bacteria, natural fungi, that kind of thing. That's what I'm talking about. That's the ideal leaf litter for isopods. They will eat just leaves that have dried once they fall off the tree, but they're just not nearly as nutritious.
Okay. And is there a best leaf litter? So many different types of trees. Are there trees we got to avoid? Are there ones we should look for?
Well, some of the most popular ones used in the hobby, oak leaves are great. They decay fairly slowly. They have a lot of nutrition, but they decay so slowly. The tannins have to break down a bit and stuff, and that takes a while. That it's not good to rely just on leaves like that. And others like that, oak or magnolia, things like sea grape, anything that takes a long time to decay can be a good one, but you don't want to just use that sort of leaf because it takes forever to decay. So I like to use maple. I use redbud, willow. I use some pecan. I use apple, plum, pear. I have a Kentucky yellowwood tree. I use that. Those are some of the ones that I use. I feel like most trees, if there are not known toxins in the leaves, that most broadleaf deciduous trees are fine. You do want to avoid like pine needles and spruce needles, fir needles, that sort of thing. But most of the others are good. I do avoid using cherry leaves because cherry trees do produce cyanide of some form at certain times, and I'm not sure when, and that is a problem when it's not, so I just avoid using cherry leaves. But other than that, everything else in my yard is fair game. Even the walnut leaves do contain toxins. Once they dry out, those toxins are greatly reduced, and isopods seem fine eating them.
Okay. Whoops. There's a question. What temperature do isopods prefer overall?
That does depend on the species. Most isopods, I would say, in the hobby are fine in room temp range between, say, 70 to 80, 85 Fahrenheit. Somewhere in there, it's just fine. Some species prefer it a little cooler, a little warmer. There are certain of the Cubara species from Southeast Asia that it's at high 70s to low 80s, seem to do better and breed faster at those temperatures, that kind of thing. Some just don't thrive when it's too cool. There are others like Oniscus ocellus, the skirted isopod, which tends to do better at cooler temperatures. So if you have a room, you can put it on a lower shelf so the temperature is a couple of degrees cooler. That tends to be a benefit for them. But most of the isopods that exist in the U.S. and can be shipped across state lines legally, things like that, they're adaptable enough that if you're comfortable, they are comfortable, and they might be comfortable at even cooler temperatures or warmer temperatures than you.
All right, here's how often should I treat my isopods to beta bits or fish food? So let's talk about giving them a little bit more than leaf litter and keeping them off of our reptiles.
Yeah. So if you're giving them things like fish food or the dried shrimp or bits of squash, they really love bits of squash, pumpkin, green beans, green peas, anything like that. They love to have some little snacks. Sweet potato. I like to give them raw slices of sweet potato. That's good. Carrots work for a lot of them too, like grated or chopped carrots are a good thing you can give them. I even give mine pellets of dog food, like dog food kibble, and they'll go after that. They love it. So there are a lot of things you can give them. I would say it depends very much on the population density of your isopods. If you have an established colony and it's fairly dense, you should probably be giving them supplemental food for maximum reproduction, assuming that's the goal, every day. Okay. And you'll see them swarm that food, eat it, and and then it's gone, and you know you're in good shape. With a new colony of isopods on the other end of the spectrum, new colony of isopods, people will often say, I've tried feeding my new colony of isopods and they don't eat. And I ended up making a video just specifically on the topic of how a new isopod colony is different from an older established colony, because most of the time you have put a smorgasbord of nutritious elements into this enclosure when you set it up. You've put decaying leaf litter, you've put possibly some decayed wood, you've things like that they're going to be eating. And so when you put 12, 15 isopods in a 6-quart tub with all of this food and all this space and they're not competing with very many other isopods for food, they don't need a lot.
Mm-hmm.
They don't need a lot of supplemental food. And so you can put that food in there and it may very well be ignored. Now, 2 or 3 months later, depending on the isopod species, or 6 months later, a year later, depending, how much they're breeding and all that stuff and which species it is, you may find that you can throw food in there every day and it'll disappear. But at first, they're going to be eating very, very little. So I would just recommend putting like 1 pellet or 1 flake of fish food in there if it's a small number of isopods, seeing how fast it's gone, like we were talking about before. If it's gone within 24 hours, feed more. If not, wait until it molds. If it starts molding, take it out. And then you can gauge how much your population is able to do. I have a little desktop. It's a small enclosure, but it has a couple of hundred isopods in it on my desk at work. And one of the staple foods is just a pellet of cheap dog food kibble. I'll just drop a pellet in there every day, and I'll watch the swarm just. And the next hour or two after I drop that in there, I can look over there and see this ball of isopods just swarming it, and then it's completely gone. And then I do the same thing the next day. Okay. So it can get to that point, but it's not going to do that immediately.
All right, we are coming to the end of our hour, but I'd like to close off with, where is the isopod community going? At what state of growth is it, and where do you see it headed?
Great question. I'm kind of wondering myself how many more new species there are out there to discover, because the Marullinella genus has been the last late craze, but there haven't really been a whole lot of others generous discovered since then. That genus has, I think they're still discovering a few more in that genus, but the Cubaris, they seem to kind of leveled off. That Marullinella genus probably leveled off a little bit. And so I don't know how many more. There'll probably be more. I'm not going to say they'll never find any more, but I think it's kind of slowing down. I'm hoping where the isopod community is going, and I think to some degree it is going this way, is that we will focus more on improving husbandry for what we have, finding out, like Marullinellas are still at the stage where some people are having success and they're still crashing for some people, and we can't quite tell why. They're not breeding as well as some of the others still, but some people are having excellent success. So we need to get what the recipe is. We need to get that down. And we need to be focusing more on finding out what works best for the different isopods we have out there, and also more education. I think we have issues with people importing wild caught isopods and then finding out that they can't find them anymore in their wild environments, which is a horrible thing. We don't want happening, but we're getting reports of that. So that kind of thing needs to end, I think, and I hope it does soon. And we need to focus more on what we have in the hobby and making life better for those isopods, and in gathering more data, like the thing we were talking about with our isopods, a problem with reptile eggs. Are isopods actually attacking living reptiles? We need to gather more of that data so that we have something a little bit more concrete to work with.
All right. Now, Rus, for those of us who are just absolutely enthralled by this new world, where is the best place to find information about isopods, the varieties, and how to take care of them?
Well, you can always check out my channel. That's one place. Aquarimax Pets. I produce a lot of isopod content, and I have basic tutorials that lead you through. I have a playlist that's basically isopod care, starting out with enclosures and substrates and going through foods and feeding and breeding and all the different things. And I also have species-specific info. So here's a species profile and what's different about this species and how is its care different and what can you expect from it in terms of behavior? Is it good for bioactive? That kind of thing. So I have a big long playlist of isopod species care guides as well. So it's a good place to start. It's not the only place you can find isopod information. There's lots of other places as well. There's some good Facebook groups out there. There's a lot of good content creators on isopods like Supreme Gecko, Wall-8 Supreme Gecko is one. And I'm going to leave out lots of good ones, I'm sure. There's Smugbug creates, she does mostly Instagram videos, but gives like little profiles on them and stuff. So there's a lot out there. All right. Well, this is your website. Yes.
And that's so we have all sorts of, let's go to the shop. Let's see what's available. All right. Let's go. Isopods. Oh, the Montenegros.
Yeah, that's one of my favorites. And if that's not clicking through, you can scroll down. It'll still get you to the same place.
Oh, okay. Oh, look at that. All right. So everybody, this is window shopping. Oh, yeah. I would love to get involved with the zebras. Everybody, this is it. Get your fix. Get your fix. So we could just go to aquarimax.com and we can get involved in yet another obsession, which will make our lives incredibly enriched.
Love it. Yep. And I actually have a few species available now that are not on the website yet. I need to update it, but that gives you an idea.
So, all right, Russ, thank you so much for coming on by. Everybody, thank you for coming on by. And let's get on with our you know, it is such a very cool community that we have with all of these people and all these interests. I just love it. So,
it is. It's great to be able to interact with you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate your invitation and being able to share with everybody who came in. And I appreciate everyone's questions and involvement too.
All right, everyone, have a great weekend. And we'll see. You know what? I'm going to be here. Once again, everybody, I have a daily vlog. And so if 5 a.m. Pacific. And so if you're up that early on the weekends, not as early on the East, but on the weekends and every day, 5 a.m. Pacific, I've got a vlog. You can launch and I am live in the chat during the first showing. And so that's kind of fun. That's when I will see you all next. And if you don't want to get up, I'll be live tomorrow at 5 o'clock for Pacific for Chameleon Chore Night. It's not an official show, everybody. Don't expect any entertainment. I'm just sitting there making fruit fly cultures. But a number of you just enjoy hanging out and doing Chameleon Chore Night. So everybody's welcome.
Awesome.
So, all right. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks for having me.